Warning of a potential coronavirus catastrophe among millions of people displaced by the war in Syria. Refugees International says the cramped conditions in camps will let the virus spread easily. Nearly 3 million civilians are boxed into a small area in Idlib province, which housed just 500,000 before the war 9 years ago. So far, the virus is known to have killed 3 Syrians and infected 42, mostly in the capital, Damascus. But doctors fear a major outbreak could result in what they're calling a bloodbath, because 83% of the population lives in poverty. And hospitals in Idlib have fewer than 100 ventilators to treat around 3 million people. Chris Doyle is the director of the Council for Arab-British Understanding. He joins us via Skype from London. Thanks very much for being with us. So we heard there's the problems with the infrastructure in Syria. How vulnerable is it to a potential outbreak of coronavirus?
Well, it's extremely vulnerable because much of that infrastructure has been destroyed over 9 years of conflict. In the case of Idlib, the World Health Organization reported that 84 health centers, hospitals had been bombed, damaged, and forced to close because of the Russian and Syrian regime assault on Idlib that intensified last December. But it's not only that. You also have the doctors who've been killed and maimed. You have the way in which that so many of those displaced people in Idlib, about half the population, of course, are not well nourished, suffering often acute malnourishment, and you don't have access from international aid agencies. So all of this, contributes to a very poor situation. On top of that, particularly in the internally displaced people's camps that you find now close to the Turkish border, very crowded, very unhygienic. You have the absolute perfect conditions for the spread of any form of virus, including COVID-19. The idea of social distancing or cleaning your hands with clean, fresh water, let alone, of course, also access to face masks or hand gel, well, that's just a dream. But, of course, in Idlib, it's a question of a crisis upon crisis upon crisis. The crisis of the conflict, there's a very shaky ceasefire there at the moment that could break down at any moment. You have an economic crisis that's hitting all of Syria, where you have the Syrian pound has crashed to its lowest rate against the dollar in history. You have massive unemployment, inflation, but particularly the food prices have rocketed up. There's a massive shortage of wheat that is affecting Syrians everywhere, under the regime's control or in opposition areas, wherever. And going forward, this is also a massive crisis. And then you have the impending doom of a possible outbreak of COVID-19.
Yeah.
And we simply don't.
Just wanted to ask you, sorry to interrupt, I wanted to ask you, Syria has been out of the headlines a lot because of coronavirus. Just, can you give us an idea of what the situation is in terms of militarily on the ground and whether there's any progress towards resolving the issue there?
Well, in Idlib itself, we had a ceasefire that was agreed to on the 5th of March between Russia and Turkey, and essentially that has more or less held. We haven't seen the extreme ferocity of the assault on Idlib, the last area of Syria, to remind you, that is still held by Syrian opposition. So to that extent, it has calmed. So we have seen sporadic bits of violence, but it's much better. And you see, actually, some of those internally displaced people fearing an outbreak of the virus have returned to some of their homes where, if they're still standing, they have to also bear the risk of unexploded ordnance. That's another challenge for them. But it's possibly safer for them back in their homes in their original towns than crammed into these camps, which could be, 10 to 15 people in a tent, hemmed together with no real options to isolate themselves.
Chris Doyle, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you.